Hi, this is Derek, and we are going into week 7 of novel writing basics, and this is the second part of Act 2, where we will be writing towards the dark night of the soul, or the peak drama. So I've called this slide, or this section, Tragedy Strikes. This will be the period of the most emotional impact, both on your readers and also your characters. This is kind of, everything is coming together. And all the build-up, all the scene building, and the work that you've done so far is trying to get to this point where you build up the stakes and the risks and the conflict into kind of a frenzy that cannot be contained and is overwhelming. So probably the characters have been dealing with challenges and problems the whole book so far, but they haven't been broken yet. They've been able to respond in an appropriate way, even if it was sad or scary or frustrating. But the conflict is escalating, and it reaches a point where they just can't deal anymore. They are not capable, they're not strong enough to deal with the conflict, and they get to this point where they have an emotional breakdown or they run away and give up the fight. And these two words are really important because it's a tragedy, which means it has really deep emotional impact, and it strikes like lightning, which means it's unexpected. So even if they know that they're going into battle, like I said earlier, they're not trying to get into peak conflict. They are trying to preserve themselves, that they're going to make smart plans. But something unexpected is going to happen that they are not equipped for, they're not prepared for, and that's what's really going to overwhelm them. I will also point out, even if you're not writing a tragedy or like an epic fantasy or something, maybe you're writing a memoir or a comedy or something kind of fun, even then I would try to sort of follow this model, which again looks something like this. So in most like fantasy or sci-fi, in most commercial fiction, there's going to be a lot of stuff happening. There's going to be a lot of external, real conflict and actual bad guys or antagonists. In something maybe like a memoir that doesn't have this really strict plot outline, you still want the emotional pathos to be building up, which just means if everything is really dramatic, then nothing is really growing. So I found this picture of dramatic structure, and the main point that I wanted to show you is that the drama will build, which means the emotions and the stakes and the risks, the tension, the violence, everything kind of builds to a head, and there's some sort of maximum action, which is called the climax, which has to be resolved, and often this is something that forces the character to change, which is why, like I said earlier, it has to be more than the character can currently handle. So they're, doing the best that they can, but they're handling what comes up, becoming increasingly frustrated or unstable or putting things at risk, until finally they get to this point of kind of the pot is boiling over and it demands a dramatic response. It forces a response that previously they weren't able to or comfortable giving, and this could be sort of a death of the self. They were holding on to their dreams or their self-identity, and they finally have found something they care about more than themselves, which they've decided is worth risking their personal safety or their self-identity for, which is why I pointed out, like, even if this is a memoir, even if this is a comedy or something, there should be still enough conflict, tension, and drama so that the character is forced to either change, or this is just kind of a defining moment. If your story doesn't kind of look like this with building drama, and you don't have this kind of life-changing moment, this may not be it may not be quite as powerful emotionally of a story as it could be. And I think I said earlier in the beginning that all of the best stories will impact people in an emotional way. So in order to actually reach what I call peak drama, you need basically three things, but I actually added a fourth that I'll share with you also. So they need enough information to make an informed decision. This information might be flawed. They're probably going to be surprised by something unexpected that they didn't predict, but they're going to think that they've learned enough about what's going on to make the best choice that they possibly can. And because now that they've already passed this midpoint where they've kind of decided to take a more active role, during this second half of Act 2, they're going to be making some plans and decisions. By about the midpoint, they should feel like they have a pretty good grasp of what they're up against, what the opposition is, what's actually happening. They're going to be surprised by some revelations later anyway, but they should have enough, they should think they know what's going on enough to be proactive and start making some decisions. They also need enough at stake to make a calculated risk. So if they don't have anything at stake, if they don't have anything they care about, that they are threatened with losing, which means they don't have any skin in the game, they could just walk away, and they wouldn't be losing anything that they can't bear to lose. So they've decided kind of by the midpoint that that they're in this fight, which means either they're fighting for themselves or someone else or the world at large. It could be, they want to be kind of a hero and stand up for other people, or it might just be they're still, for whatever reason, the antagonist or these other forces are coming down hard on them, and they're just trying to survive or save their friends or save their family. They may be not really heroic, but just forced into a terrible position. But it has to be something that they're not willing to lose so that they will put themselves at risk. And they won't just go in there guns blazing crazy, but they will try to think about what's happening and how they can navigate the danger or defeat the antagonist or save themselves or those that they care about, and they'll make a plan to try to mitigate the risk a little bit. But at the end of the day, they have to take action to try to save whatever they can't bear to lose. And then finally, they're going to need to feel enough responsibility so that they feel guilt or loss. So basically, you have to figure out what do they care about enough to fight for? What is the antagonist trying to destroy? What are they trying to protect? Or it could even just be what are they trying to prevent? For example, in a lot of thrillers, maybe the antagonist has an evil plan to destroy a country or, attack a school or something terrible. It must be something bad enough to force them to take action and put themselves at risk. And what you're actually going to do at the Dark Night of the Soul is take away that one thing that they can't bear to lose. It's possible that they prevent something and they stop the bad guy from the big thing, but in doing so, they also lose something more personal that's closer to their heart. They don't necessarily need to lose it for good. Maybe this is where somebody else is injured or kidnapped. But it should be the point where everything is slipping away from them. They feel weak and powerless. They feel out of control. They feel like whatever stakes or battles they're up against are way outside their power to survive. And then a fourth one that I added is they also need to be vulnerable enough to be destroyed. And I put wounded at first, but kind of like I said earlier, if this is just a story where they are a little bit vulnerable and they are a little bit wounded, that's more of a low-key, interesting short story. If you want to have a really emotionally powerful book, their identity needs to be shattered. And partly because if they aren't destroyed, if their identity isn't shattered, then they're not forced to change. And even in, for example, something like a romance, even like a comedy romance, they will probably spend a lot of the book not being vulnerable. They will be closing up their hearts. They will be not taking risks. They don't want to make a fool of themselves. They don't want to, put their hearts on the table or wear their hearts on the sleeve. Most characters and most people try to protect themselves by not taking big risks with their emotion or telling people how they really feel. So by the dark night of the soul, in a romance, the main character would have to discover she can't bear to live without her love interest. She's finally figured out that, this is the person she wants to spend the rest of her life with, and she will have a broken heart if she doesn't end up with him. And because she's figured out that knowledge, she's going to take a big risk and make a dramatic declaration of romantic feelings. And so in doing so, she is risking everything. She's opening the door to that tragic thing she can't bear to give up, but she also can't bear to just let it walk away. So it's forcing her to change out of her comfort zone, to take bigger risks, which changes her as a person. And probably there will be a point where she thinks she's been rejected and lost the thing that she really wanted, even though she was vulnerable. But in a romance, because it's usually happily ever after, something will happen after the dark night of the soul that will bring them together again. And so I'm going to go back to this page real quick to point a few things out. So we're in the second half of the second act, and we're just trying to build to this point of dramatic confrontation with either the antagonist or the protagonist's feelings. But you can kind of imagine it like a poker game. Through the course of the novel, they have discovered the things that they want or the things that they can't bear to lose. And by this point, they're going to risk everything they have for the outcome that they want. So in poker, we would call this going all in, which just means you push all of your money or all of your poker chips into the middle of the pot, and everything comes down to one final hand, and either you lose everything or you win big. So the point of a good book, in my opinion, is to force characters and readers to go all in. If you have a story that's just about normal life and normal things are happening, but the characters don't really care about anything enough to take big risks, then it's not going to develop emotionally. It's not going to change the characters. So you need your protagonist to have a lot on the line by putting in a lot of new challenges and conflict and dangers or antagonists to build up to this point where they're going to risk everything. They're going to confront the antagonist to stop whatever he's planning. They're going to confess their emotional feelings. But the important thing here is they will actually lose. So sometime in here, they're building up to this conflict. There's a surprise failure, possibly to a shocking revelation we talked about before. So all of this is building up to a giant loss. They risk everything and they lose everything, or they think they've lost everything. I did say earlier I wanted to talk a little bit more about the hook, line, and sinker that I used in the last video. And I looked it up, and basically what this means is someone is all in. They totally believe everything you're saying. They are invested in the ride. So hook, line, sinker means when you're fishing, it doesn't actually happen when you're fishing, but it's an expression that's been used for a couple hundred years about someone believing everything that you say. So it's often used like when you're telling a lie or a story. So maybe I use an excuse or I make something up, and I can say she totally bought it hook, line, and sinker. When you're fishing, usually you would just hook the fish. That's the part that catches the fish, but the line is the part that you reel them in and get them back in the boat. The sinker is it's the metal weight that you put on the line that takes your hook and line down deep under the water where the big fish are. So I actually tried to break this up into 3 parts to make it make more sense for novel writing. The hook is why people will keep reading. And you want to start with a strong hook, but you'll probably also have hooks at the beginning of every chapter, every section break. Every time something new happens or something changes, that's a new hook. That's going to keep them reading and invested in the story. And the hook is really important because if you don't have a hook, then they're not going to keep reading. If you don't have action, conflict, and suspense, which are things that are happening, dangers or oppositions to the main character's goals. And suspense is either why is this happening, what's going on questions, or it's what's going to happen next. So if you have enough action and conflict and you show that there's inherent danger, readers will wonder what's happening or why it's happening, and they will keep reading. So you can have a successful story just by focusing on the hook, which is just something is happening. If it's too slow, if nothing is happening or changing, if there's no conflict, then you're not really going to have a hook. And if you don't have a hook, none of the world building or the character building or the backstory, none of that's going to matter. So this is really the most important part. However, it's also possible to have a story that has a lot of action, conflict, and suspense, which is totally fine. It's a book, it's a good book, or a reasonably good book. But people may also say it's light, or it's superficial, or it just doesn't have that emotional depth. It won't impact people. It might be like a fun, easy read, but when they finish it, they may feel like they wasted their time, or nothing really happened, or it just, it was interesting, but it just didn't really matter. And they might even be a little disappointed, because if you have a lot of hook and suspense and conflict, readers will assume it's going somewhere, that it's all building to something that's going to matter. And if you get to the end of the book and none of it really matters, it was just a bunch of stuff happened, but it doesn't really impact the main characters, they may feel a little bit cheated. So the hook is what they show up for. The line is world building or lovable characters. So you do need to focus on the action, conflict, and suspense, but in between those scenes, you'll also be building out your I'll say the backstory. You're going to be building out the world with your scene description. We'll talk more about that in the editing later. And also your characters. So at this part, they are reading because things are happening. At this part, they're reading because the world is interesting and they care about what happens to the characters. On its own, world building and characterization would kind of just be like a big knot of fishing line. If you've ever gone fishing and you know that sometimes your fishing line gets all tangled up into a big bunch, that's kind of what it would be. Nobody's really going to want to take the time to untangle that knot and see how it all fits together, especially if it's just information, nothing's really happening. So although this is really important to get readers to care about what's happening. It's not the thing that gets them reading in the beginning or keeps them reading. So you need to hook them fast. You need to keep the action and the tension moving forward, but you also, whenever you can, you kind of sneak out more of the line. When you're actually fishing, you let them bite, but if you yank the hook out too quickly, then the fish will get spooked and run away. So you have to let them nibble a few times, and often you have to let the line out, which means give them more space, give them some freedom, throw in some interesting backstory or characters. In between the hooks, you're feeding them more and more lines to get them more and more committed to the world or invested to the world. So you're kind of sneaking in this characterization and world building in between the action, the conflict, and suspense. It's not what they're there for, but the more that they read it, the more they're going to care what actually happens. And then the sinker would be the emotional depth or backstory. So if you figure out your major conflict, you figure out kind of what's going to happen, and you have your action scene or your final confrontation scene or whatever, that's going to have more emotional impact if you've already dropped in some deep metal sinkers, which you could sneak in earlier, and it has to be built up kind of slowly, because in that final conflict scene, it's too late to drop all of those weights. The weights have to be there first, earlier on, so that your line sinks into the deep water and it reaches the deep fish, so that when finally you're at the end of the book, the characters are completely vulnerable, they have a lot to lose, but both the characters and the readers understand what's at stake and why it matters. They understand how much the protagonist is giving up and how much this means to them, and how much they can't bear to be making this decision. Earlier we talked about having one thing they would never do, or having one thing they fear the most, and kind of forcing them to do the thing they swore they would never do, or give up the thing that they've been hanging on to the most tightly. I'm also going to add, however, that I've been talking a lot about emotional depth and character changing, and I also acknowledge that some genres or some stories are not as character focused or character central. So, for example, in a lot of thrillers or maybe horror or suspense, it's not really about the character introspection, figuring out themselves or growing as a person. I don't think it's necessary that the final climatic battle scene, the main character has to be thwarted because of their fatal flaw or shard of glass or personality limitation. I don't think it's necessary that their eventual triumph comes from a self-sacrifice or for giving up everything. It's okay if all they do is defeat the threat and survive. So in a lot of horror movies, the protagonist will be out on a camping trip with all of her friends, and then there's a monster in the woods. The monster will kill everybody, and the protagonist will fight back enough, maybe not to defeat the monster, but just to get away, just to survive. And that's okay. That's an okay story if there's just a lot of violence or conflict or drama. In a detective story or a murder mystery, the detective or the protagonist might just unmask the Scooby-Doo villain and figure out who's behind everything. And in something like a memoir, the story would be one character going through a bunch of challenges, but emerging improved, or at least with deeper, profound knowledge. The majority of stories are going to have some type of eventual triumph, maybe not necessarily a happy ending, but some kind of resolution where the protagonist at least survives. Maybe not, maybe they don't win $1 million and get rich, but they at least survive and they are changed or improved isn't really the word that I like, but maybe they are hardened, or they have more confidence, or they have more understanding or appreciation of others. They've learned something through the journey, so they are different than who they were when they started out. And I think it's also important that this eventual triumph comes through action that was difficult to take. So I also added this part, difficult action, eventual triumph through difficult action. If it was just easy, if they didn't have to risk anything or give up anything, or they didn't have to grow as a person, it's not a very interesting story. So it probably has to have some kind of eventual triumph or happy ending, and they need to be responsible for the outcome. It also shouldn't just be, and then they got lucky, or then they had a happy accident and everything just worked out. The outcome should be directly tied to the action that they took, and that action should be difficult for them to take. So those are just some things to think about this week. This is still just kind of the first rough draft part. So if this stuff seems too deep or too complicated or too emotional, keep it in the back of your mind. It's really not the most important thing to be focused on during the first rough draft. I do think that especially these three things you should keep in mind while you're building towards the Dark Night of the Soul. But maybe you just have a lot of action scenes or events and you haven't figured this stuff out yet. That's okay. Later in the editing or the revision process, we can go back through and make sure that you add some of this stuff so that your ending is more dramatic. In the first rough draft, the only thing that you really need to focus on is to make sure that there's still action and conflict and suspense all the way through your novel. You can have slower scenes. I just finished a novel where I have a few places where there are just several pages of her thinking about stuff, and I actually need to go back and break up all that thinking and give it some more action, even if it's a little bit of scene transition where she's doing something. I think I might have said this last week, but if I didn't, I'll repeat it. You want to be giving them action while they're thinking. So even if they decide they're going to go take a shower or they're going to do the dishes, give them something to do while they're thinking about those things, so they're not just standing there doing nothing. It's kind of like you press pause and your characters are just standing there while either they're thinking things or the narrator is just info dumping a whole bunch of new content directly to the readers. You don't want your characters just standing around. So give them something to do. But since we are working on the first rough draft, all you really need to do is get down a whole bunch of words and focus on what's actually happening. You can improve the conflict later, and you can add more suspense later. Conflict is an addition. With conflict, you add more sources of opposition. I think I talked about the 3 types of conflict. You can add more conflict between external sources and internal sources, between your characters, but this is all addition. Suspense is actually subtraction, where you take information away. So rather than giving readers too much information so they know what's going on or what's going to happen, you build suspense by taking away information so they wonder what's going to happen. So good luck this week. I wouldn't worry too much about having an exact word count. I think I suggested to try to do about 10,000 words every week so that you end up with about 40,000 words. And then in the editing stage next month, we'll add some extra words while you're building it out and improving it. But if you have more words or less words at this point, or you're not, fitting your story onto this outline exactly, that's totally fine. Just kind of get as much ideas down on the page, as many scenes down the page as you can. Later, we may have to figure out if a scene is not essential to the story, if something isn't happening, if it doesn't develop the plot forward, it may need to be taken out. So either you have to make those scenes relevant by adding in something new that changes or impacts the plot, or it might have to be cut. But at this point, I would just write anything that's fun, anything that's interesting, whatever ideas you have. I would just try to get them down the page and then maybe see later how you can fix them or deepen the conflict to make them matter. But also possibly at that point, if you have fun scenes and you can't figure out how they matter to the story, then they may need to be cut later. So I hope this video helps. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll try to leave comments on inside the course, and good luck writing this week. Bye-bye.